Welcome to a journey back in time to 18th century Lisbon, one of the richest, most beautiful, and most powerful cities on Earth. Long before London and Paris became the centers of the modern world, Lisbon was the gateway to the globe. This city stood at the edge of Europe, looking out toward the unknown oceans, connecting continents, cultures, and empires. Lisbon was a place where the air carried the scent of cinnamon, pepper, and cloves. Its streets were built with the wealth of Brazil, and every stone echoed the memory of the great age of discovery. Ships from across the world arrived daily, bringing not just goods, but stories, ideas, and unimaginable riches. Using advanced AI technology, we have brought this lost world back to life. Old sketches, copper engravings, and oil paintings from the 1700s have been transformed into photorealistic scenes. Today, you will not only hear about history, you will see it. You will walk through the narrow, crowded streets of the Alfama district, stand before the Grand Ribera Palace, and witness the disaster that would change European philosophy, architecture, and urban planning forever. In the early 1700s, Lisbon was home to nearly 200,000 people, making it the fourth largest city in Europe, after London, Paris, and Naples. It was a city of dramatic contrasts. On one side, it was often called the New Rome, filled with over 40 churches and more than 90 convents. Religion shaped daily life, and grand processions filled the streets. On the other side, Lisbon was a chaotic medieval maze, crowded, noisy, and dangerous. Immense wealth flowed through narrow streets that still lacked basic sanitation. This golden age was brilliant, but it was also fragile, and it was moving toward a terrifying turning point. This story is about how a great city was destroyed in a single morning, and how it rose again from the ruins to become one of the first modern cities of the Enlightenment. To understand why the world was shocked when Lisbon fell, we must understand what Lisbon was in its prime. By 1750, the city was the beating heart of a global system. At the center of it all was the Tagus River, the golden throat of Europe and the lifeblood of the Portuguese Empire. In the early 1700s, this river was not just water, it was the most valuable and strategic harbor in the Atlantic world. A famous 1730 engraving shows a forest of ship masts so dense that people said you could almost cross the river by stepping from deck to deck. So why were all these ships here? The answer lies in the 5 pillars of Portuguese power that made Lisbon the center of the world economy. The first pillar was the spice trade. While other European nations struggled to reach Asia, Portugal already controlled key routes through Goa, Malacca, and Timor. Ships arrived in Lisbon carrying pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, rare and valuable treasures that Europe desperately wanted. These spices were stored in Lisbon's warehouses and sold at enormous profit. The second pillar was the silk and porcelain trade. Through the port of Macau, Portugal gained near control of Chinese porcelain, known as white gold. Aristocrats across Paris and London filled their homes with dishes and vases that had passed through Lisbon first. The third pillar was Africa. By controlling ports in Angola and Mozambique, Portugal dominated Atlantic trade routes. Ivory, rare woods, and gold flowed into Lisbon, filling royal treasuries and merchant fortunes. But the fourth pillar was the most powerful of all, Brazilian gold. After massive gold deposits were discovered in Brazil in 1695, a river of wealth crossed the Atlantic. Nearly 1,000 tons of gold and millions of diamonds arrived in Lisbon in the decades before disaster struck. Few cities in history have ever experienced such sudden and overwhelming wealth. This fortune transformed Lisbon into a cultural and scientific center. The king invested heavily in prestige projects, including one of the world's most advanced aqueduct systems.
He also gathered secret collections of nautical maps called roteiros, which contained highly classified navigation knowledge, essentially the nuclear codes of the 18th century. By 1750, Lisbon was the world's greatest warehouse and one of its wealthiest creditors. Yet the riverfront was also loud, dirty, and chaotic. Dozens of languages filled the air: Dutch, English, Italian, African dialects, mixed with the rough voices of Portuguese dockworkers. The Ribeira district, once the center of Portugal's global power, is today known as Praça de Comércio. This wide open square stands on the ruins of greatness and tragedy. Later, we will return here to see how this place was rebuilt after one of the greatest disasters in European history. Imagine standing here in the early 1700s, facing the Ribeira Palace. This was the royal home of the Portuguese kings for more than 250 years. Just as Versailles symbolized French power, the Ribeira Palace represented Portugal's global reach. It was first built in the early 1500s,
King Manuel I, and expanded again and again over the centuries. By the mid-1700s, it had become a true treasure house. Inside the palace were more than 70,000 books in the royal library, hundreds of priceless paintings by masters such as Titian and Rubens, and the secret archives of the Age of Discovery. These included maps and navigation charts that revealed hidden sea routes to Asia. King João V poured enormous wealth into this palace, rivaling the luxury of the French court. Fueled by Brazilian gold, he transformed the Portuguese court into a dazzling display of Baroque excess. He did not want to be just a king. He wanted to be seen as the most powerful Catholic ruler in Europe. He paid vast sums to the Pope for prestigious titles and covered the royal chapel in gold and silver. Yet the palace was more than a symbol of luxury. It was the administrative heart of an empire that stretched from South America to Africa and all the way to Indonesia. On its lower floors, clerks recorded spice prices, counted gold bars, and managed global trade. Today, the Ribeira Palace is completely gone. Not a single stone remains. When we reach the year 1755, you will understand why. In its place now stands the open expanse of Praça do Comércio, a silent reminder of what was lost. To truly understand 18th century Lisbon, you must understand its deep relationship with God. One of the city's greatest religious monuments is the Jerónimos Monastery in Belém. Even in the 1700s, it was already over 200 years old. It is a masterpiece of Manueline architecture, a uniquely Portuguese style filled with maritime symbols, ropes, anchors, coral, and sea creatures carved into stone. The monastery was funded by the pepper tax, a 5% levy on goods arriving from India. In the 18th century, it served as the spiritual heart of Lisbon. Sailors prayed here before leaving on dangerous voyages that could last 3 years or more. Those who survived returned to give thanks for their lives. Nearby stands the Belém Tower. In the 1700s, it stood much farther out in the river than it does today. It was the last thing sailors saw when leaving Lisbon and the first thing they saw when returning home. The tower was both a ceremonial gateway and a place of fear. Beneath it were dark, damp prisons where criminals and political prisoners were held, sometimes forgotten as the tide slowly rose around them. Further inland stood the Carmo convent, towering above Rocio Square. It was the most important Gothic church in Lisbon and one of the city's most recognizable landmarks. Its library was famous throughout Europe, and its height made it visible from almost anywhere in the city. Religion was everywhere in Lisbon. There was a church or chapel on nearly every corner.
The sound of bells filled the air, marking prayer times and daily events. But this deep devotion also had a dark side, one that Enlightenment thinkers in Paris and London viewed with horror. This is Rossio Square, the center of public life. In the 1700s, it hosted markets, festivals, and celebrations. But it was also the stage for the auto da fe, the public punishments of the Portuguese Inquisition. Portugal was a deeply conservative and religious society. The Inquisition, established in 1536, was still active in the 18th century. It targeted so-called New Christians, Jews who had been forced to convert but were suspected of practicing their faith in secret. It also persecuted people accused of heresy, witchcraft, or forbidden behavior. While Enlightenment thinkers spread through Europe, people were still burned at the stake in Rossio Square. These executions were public spectacles attended by the king and nobility. Victims were marched through the streets wearing sanbenitos, yellow robes marked with red crosses, before being led to their deaths. This created a strange and unsettling atmosphere. Lisbon was a city of enormous wealth, stunning art, and global power, but also a city of fear and censorship. Books were banned, and new ideas were smuggled in secretly like illegal goods. Today, Rocicho is a place of joy and gathering. The former headquarters of the Inquisition was replaced by the Dona Maria II National Theater. The city has moved beyond this dark chapter, but in the 1700s, the Inquisition shaped daily life. If you left the grand palaces by the river and climbed into the hills, you entered another world. This is Alfama, the oldest district in Lisbon. It is a maze of narrow streets and steep alleys, shaped by centuries of history. Alfama survived the Moorish occupation and the Christian reconquest, preserving the medieval soul of the city. Here, Lisbon felt older, poorer, and more human, a sharp contrast to the golden splendor of the riverfront. In the 1700s, life in Lisbon was lived out on the streets. Houses were small, dark, and crowded, so daily life spilled outdoors. People cooked their food outside, washed their clothes in public, and talked with neighbors in the open air. The streets were always alive with movement and sound. You would often see the varinhas, the famous fishwives of Lisbon. They carried heavy baskets of sardines on their heads and walked through the streets calling out prices in loud, rhythmic voices that sounded almost like music. Their calls became part of the city's everyday soundtrack. Lisbon also suffered from a serious water problem. There was no running water inside homes. Instead, people depended on public fountains scattered around the city. Carrying water was
hard physical labor, and this work was done mainly by the Gallegos, immigrants from Galicia in northern Spain. They carried large barrels of water up Lisbon's steep hills to rich and poor neighborhoods alike. The Gallegos were often looked down upon and treated as a lower class, yet the city could not function without them. Without their strength and labor, Lisbon would have ground to a halt in a single day. Across the hill stood Bairro Alto. During the daytime, it was a quiet area where aristocrats and skilled craftsmen lived. But when night fell, the neighborhood transformed. It became the center of Lisbon's nightlife. This was where Fado was born, though in the 1700s it was still taking shape, growing out of the songs of sailors, dock workers, and people living on the margins of society. At night, the soft, melancholic sound of the Portuguese guitar echoed through the narrow streets. But the darkness also carried danger. Crime was common, and sanitation was terrible. People emptied chamber pots from windows, shouting, "Agua vai!" water goes, as a warning to anyone below. Then came All Saints' Day, one of the most important religious holidays of the year. Nearly the entire population of Lisbon was inside churches, packed tightly together.
Thousands of candles burned on the altars, and the air was heavy with incense and prayer. At 9:40 in the morning, the ground began to shake. This was no ordinary earthquake. It was a massive undersea quake, later estimated to be between 8.5 and 9.0 in magnitude. The shaking lasted nearly 6 minutes, an eternity during such a disaster. In great stone churches like the Carmo convent and the Lisbon cathedral, roofs collapsed instantly, crushing thousands of worshippers beneath the rubble. In the narrow streets of Alfama and Baixa, buildings leaned, cracked, and fell into one another. These crowded neighborhoods became deadly traps. Those who survived ran toward the river. The Tagus offered open space, away from collapsing buildings. Thousands gathered along the stone quays of the Ribeira, turning back to watch their city crumble. Then something terrifying happened. The water began to pull away from the shore. The earthquake had triggered a massive tsunami. About 40 minutes later, a wall of water between 20 and 30 feet high rushed up the Tagus River. It slammed into the riverfront, sweeping away people, docks, and the lower levels of the royal palace. But the disaster was still not over. Remember the thousands of candles burning in the churches. Many had fallen into the wooden ruins of homes and religious buildings. Within an hour, dozens of small fires merged into a single firestorm. With streets blocked by rubble and the water system destroyed, there was no way to fight the flames. For 5 days, the fire burned uncontrollably. Lisbon was not just destroyed, it was shaken, drowned, and burned. The human loss was staggering. Out of a population of around 200,000, between 30,000 and 60,000 people died. The physical destruction was almost total. Around 85% of the city's buildings were destroyed. The Ribeira Palace vanished completely. The Royal Library, with its 70,000 priceless books, burned to ash. The secret archives of the Age of Discovery were lost forever. Masterpieces by artists like Titian and Rubens were reduced to smoke and dust. The ruins of the Carmo convent still stand today. It was left untouched as a memorial to the disaster. When you stand beneath its broken arches and look up at the open sky, you are seeing exactly what survivors saw in November 1755. Lisbon had become a skeleton of a city that was once the richest in the world. But the earthquake shook more than buildings. It shook the foundations of European thought. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Rousseau asked how a just and loving God could allow such a disaster to strike a deeply religious city on a holy day. This tragedy helped end blind religious optimism and played a major role in the rise of the Enlightenment. In the aftermath, King José I was overwhelmed by fear. He became terrified of stone buildings and refused to live inside them. For the rest of his life, he stayed in a luxurious complex of tents outside the city. The responsibility for rebuilding Lisbon fell to one man, the king's prime minister, Marqués de Pombal. According to legend, when asked what should be done, Pombal replied simply, "Bury the dead and feed the living." Pombal was a man of the Enlightenment. He saw destruction as an opportunity. He ignored old church boundaries and noble privileges, ordered the ruins cleared, and designed a new rational city center, the Baixa Pombalina, one that would change urban planning forever. Pombal introduced something the world had never seen before: earthquake-resistant construction. For the first time in history, buildings were designed to survive natural disasters. Every new structure had to include the Pombaline cage, a flexible wooden framework hidden inside the walls. This frame was designed to bend and sway during an earthquake instead of collapsing. To test these designs, Pombal used an unusual method. He ordered soldiers to march in rhythm around scale models of the buildings, creating vibrations that simulated earthquake waves. If the structure held, it passed the test. Pombal also transformed the entire city through standardization. The beautiful azulejo tiles that decorate Lisbon's buildings today were mass-produced under his direction. This allowed the city to be rebuilt faster, cheaper, and more uniformly. The medieval Lisbon of narrow, dirty alleys was replaced with wide, straight streets. These new boulevards allowed sunlight and fresh air to flow through the city. They also made it easier for trade, transportation, and even troops to move quickly when needed. Order replaced chaos. This vision reached its peak at the heart of the new city, Praça do Comércio, built on the exact site where the Ribeira Palace once stood. By naming it Commerce Square, Pombal sent a clear message to the world. Portugal was no longer defined only by religion and empire. It was now a modern commercial nation. The grand Rua Augusta Arch stands as a gateway from the river into the rebuilt city. At the center of the square is a bronze statue of King José I, shown riding his horse over crushed snakes. It is a powerful symbol, order triumphing over chaos, reason overcoming disaster. Today, Praça do Comércio is Lisbon's living room. It is one of the most beautiful squares in Europe. When you walk across it, you are walking above the ruins of the old royal palace, above the path of the great tsunami, and within the heart of a city that refused to die. Lisbon's history is a story of extreme contrasts. It rose as the queen of the seas, fell in fire, water, and stone, and was reborn as a city of the future. The 1700s began with the glitter of Brazilian gold and ended with the clean, elegant lines of Pombaline architecture. It was the century that carried Lisbon from the medieval world into the modern age. Behind the grand facades and busy tourist streets, the spirit of the 18th century still lives on. It survives in saudade, that uniquely Portuguese feeling of longing for something lost. It lives in the resilient stones of Alfama and the defiant arches of the Carmo convent. Lisbon is a city that has seen the end of the world and chose to keep going. Its story reminds us that even after the greatest disasters, beauty can be rebuilt. Not just beautiful again, but stronger, wiser, and more enduring than before. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the golden and tragic history of Lisbon, let us know in the comments. Which city's secrets should we uncover next using AI lens? Should we walk the streets of Edo period Japan or explore the marble halls of ancient Rome? Thank you for watching. I'm Tanvir, and together we'll keep history alive. I'll see you in the next video.